Harley-Davidson didn't just make bad decisions, they hired people who dismantled everything the brand stood for. One woman delivered the fatal blow. From heritage destruction to cultural betrayal, this story has it all. Watch until the end, because Harley's fall wasn't an accident. It was an execution, from yogurt to Harley's downfall. Harley-Davidson didn't fall because of a competitor. It didn't collapse because riders stopped loving motorcycles. It was undone by insiders, people who were supposed to protect it. And at the center of it all was a woman whose background had nothing to do with the road, the machine, or the roar. Her name was Heather Malinchek, and her arrival marked the beginning of Harley's identity crisis. Malinchek wasn't a rider. She wasn't part of the culture. She came from General Mills, where her days were spent marketing cereals, fruit snacks, and granola bars to suburban families. Her resume boasted successful campaigns for yogurt products and breakfast cereals, but nothing remotely connected to engines, leather, or the open highway. And yet Harley-Davidson handed her the keys to its brand, the most iconic name in American motorcycling, expecting her to broaden its appeal. From day one, Malinchek approached Harley like it was a breakfast brand. She believed motorcycles could be marketed like shelf-stable goods. Focus groups replaced road tests. Brand statements were written in boardrooms instead of workshops. To her, Harley wasn't a cultural icon, it was a lifestyle product, something to be polished, packaged, and resold to a new demographic with more spending power and fewer opinions. She didn't want to speak to riders, she wanted to speak to aspirational urban consumers. The damage came fast. Legacy messaging, gritty, raw, defiant, was suddenly rephrased in sterile corporate language. Print ads with bearded men gripping worn handlebars gave way to slick digital banners showing manicured fingers gripping helmets like fashion accessories. Harley's branding didn't just evolve, it was hijacked, reprogrammed, and stripped of its voice. If this shift away from real riders hits a nerve, hit like and drop a comment below. Your story still matters, even if Harley stopped listening. But this wasn't just bad branding. It was the start of something far more dangerous. Marketing without a soul. Malinchek's crowning achievement was a campaign she called More Roads to Harley. To the board, it sounded like a strategy to bring new people into the fold, but to the riding community, it was a slap in the face, a rejection of everything Harley stood for. Instead of building bridges between generations of riders, it burned them. The campaign imagery featured models, young, attractive, and clearly not motorcyclists, posing in stylized urban scenes. One leaned against a Harley while sipping a latte, another posed in a crosswalk while holding a helmet like a handbag. There were no back roads, no bug-splattered windshields, no sense of adventure. It was a glossy, soulless fantasy that felt more like a fashion editorial than a motorcycle ad. Gone were the grizzled mechanics. Gone were the dusty garages. Gone were the roadside diners where real riders refueled after 300 miles of wind. The roads in More Roads to Harley didn't go anywhere. They looped endlessly around curated social identities and marketing buzzwords. The campaign wasn't about riders, it was about optics. It was an effort to replace grit with gloss, rebellion with relatability. Instead of honoring the American blue-collar spirit, it tried to airbrush it out of existence. And the riding community noticed. Forums exploded with backlash. "This isn't Harley," one writer posted. "This is cosplay." Yet Malinchek and her team pushed forward, convinced they were shaping the future. But the most insulting move wasn't what she showed, it was what she erased. Don't ride stripped down like their bikes. Our full gear list is in the description. The riders they tried to erase. The true betrayal came not from the staged photo shoots, but from what was happening behind closed doors. Internal communications, later revealed through a wrongful termination lawsuit, showed just how deep the contempt ran for Harley's core audience. In one email, Malinchek described Harley's traditional customer base as an aging demographic with declining purchasing power. In another, she dismissed concerns from dealers about customer backlash as resistance to progress. But perhaps the most damning quote came from a former Harley marketing director who testified that Malinchek had instructed her team to stop using images of typical Harley riders because they were off-brand. Those riders, the backbone of Harley-Davidson for nearly 120 years, were suddenly seen as liabilities. It wasn't just visual. The language changed too. Words like freedom, grit, and independence were replaced by vague lifestyle slogans. Instead of riding into the sunset, Harley's new ads asked consumers to find your vibe. What used to feel like a brotherhood of the road now felt like a LinkedIn seminar on brand engagement. Worse still, symbols of Harley's culture were systematically purged. The company stopped supporting regional events that catered to long-distance riders. Merchandise shifted from leather jackets and steel-toe boots to pastel hoodies and branded water bottles. Even the logo was softened in some markets, redesigned for minimalist aesthetics and digital appeal. Malinchek didn't just misunderstand Harley. She despised what it represented, and when the community pushed back, she didn't listen. She doubled down. But she wasn't the only one who thought Harley needed fixing. The German CEO who declared war on tradition. In 2020, Harley's board brought in Jochen Zeitz, a former Puma executive, as the new CEO. They believed he could steer the company through declining sales and aging demographics. What they got instead was a leader who saw Harley's American identity not as a strength, but as a flaw to be corrected. Zeitz didn't come from motorcycles. He came from luxury sportswear. His greatest claim to fame was rebranding Puma as a European lifestyle brand through sustainability messaging and social responsibility campaigns. And he brought that same philosophy to Harley-Davidson. Under his leadership, Harley declared itself a purpose-driven company. Environmental and social governance, known as ESG, became central to Harley's future. Riders, ironically, were barely mentioned in the new mission statements. Zeitz spoke more about climate goals and social alignment than torque curves or engine rumble. Consultants from firms like McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group filled the boardrooms. Decisions weren't made in garages or based on rider feedback. They were made through slide decks and stakeholder surveys. Zeitz began pushing the company heavily toward electric motorcycles, declaring combustion engines a relic of the past. The rumble of the V-twin, the sound that had defined Harley for generations, was no longer a source of pride. It was a problem to be solved. Longtime employees noticed the shift immediately. The brand was no longer a motorcycle company. It was becoming a values-first lifestyle brand. One insider put it bluntly, "We stopped talking about the road. We started talking about optics." But he wasn't running the company for riders. He was running it for consultants. The ESG coup. Harley-Davidson didn't just shift its budget, it shifted its soul. Under Zeitz's leadership, the company began a sweeping reallocation of resources toward ESG compliance. Departments that once thrived on innovation and mechanical excellence suddenly found their budgets cut or redirected. The research and development budget for traditional engines was slashed by more than 30% over 3 years. Meanwhile, the Sustainability Office, an entity that had barely existed prior to Zeitz, saw an unprecedented increase in funding, personnel, and authority. The Livewire electric bike became the crown jewel of this new regime. It was sleek, quiet, eco-conscious, and designed to impress shareholders at Davos. But the Livewire wasn't built for Harley riders. It was built for ESG presentations. Zeitz poured hundreds of millions of dollars into electric vehicle development, all while letting models like the Road King, Fat Boy, and Street Glide wither in neglect. These weren't just strategic choices, they were ideological. Harley wasn't chasing market demand, it was chasing media approval. Behind closed doors, staff began to whisper that Harley didn't make bikes anymore, it made PowerPoint slides. Engineering decisions were filtered through sustainability frameworks. Parts were chosen based on recycled content, not performance or durability. Even supplier contracts were rewritten to include environmental impact clauses that ballooned costs and complicated production. The result was devastating. The bikes became abstract. They looked like Harley-Davidsons but felt like something else entirely. Machines stripped of their soul in exchange for regulatory compliance and positive press. Riders noticed. Reviews called the new lineup soulless, corporate, and eerily quiet. Dealerships struggled to explain to lifelong customers why the throttle response felt muted, why the exhaust no longer roared, and why the new model seemed more like exhibits than motorcycles. But as the spreadsheets grew cleaner, the dealerships grew silent. The internal purge. It started as a culture shift. It became a purge. Zeitz's transformation of Harley wasn't limited to product strategy. It reached deep into the walls of the company itself. The old guard, engineers, mechanics, marketers, and plant managers who had dedicated their lives to the brand found themselves slowly edged out. Some were let go quietly. Others were forced into retirement or reassigned under the weight of new performance metrics they were never designed to meet. The new Harley rewarded compliance. not creativity. Loyalty was redefined, not to the brand or its history, but to the ESG metrics and rebranded mission statements pouring out of the C-suite. HR policies were overhauled. Entire departments were restructured to reflect the new cultural direction. Internal documents stopped referring to riders and started referring to mobility users. Heritage wasn't just devalued, it was scrubbed out of the company's language. Longtime staff reported feeling like outsiders in a company they helped build. A designer who worked on the Dyna platform for more than 20 years was asked to redesign a new electric model without any of the legacy visual cues. He called it the day he realized he didn't recognize his own work anymore. Another marketing director recounted how the phrase "loud and proud" was removed from a campaign draft for being potentially insensitive and off-brand. These weren't just edits, they were signals. Bright, blinking indicators that Harley no longer valued the identity it had spent a century crafting. One by one, the builders, thinkers, and believers who had anchored Harley to its community were replaced with compliance officers, ESG analysts, and brand consultants who had never ridden a mile in their lives. The company's institutional memory was wiped like a hard drive. But the real bloodbath was still to come, the purge of the legacy dealers. Harley-Davidson's identity was never forged in boardrooms or branding agencies. It was built in small-town showrooms, mom-and-pop dealerships, and family-run shops that smelled like grease, coffee, and old leather. These weren't just places to buy motorcycles, they were the spiritual nerve centers of American motorcycling. But when Larry Hund arrived at Harley in 2019, he brought with him a radically different vision. With 25 years at Tiffany & Company under his belt, Hund wasn't interested in community. He was interested in elevating the brand. His mission was clear: strip Harley dealerships of their grid and replace it with gloss. But it didn't stop at interior design. Hund spearheaded a brutal campaign of closures and shutdowns targeting Harley's legacy dealers, those family-owned stores that had kept the company afloat through recessions, oil crises, and foreign competition. Internal memos revealed his true intentions. Dealers who had been in business for generations were labeled misaligned with our premium positioning. That phrase became a corporate death sentence. These were people who knew 3 generations of riders by name, men and women who had stayed open late to help stranded bikers, who sponsored charity rides and veterans events, and now they were disposable. Hund saw legacy as an inconvenience. In his world, heritage was a liability, not an asset. The human toll was staggering. Dozens of multi-generational dealerships were either squeezed out through new franchise requirements or bought up by luxury-focused corporate chains that treated riders like customers, not family. And yet what these communities lost wasn't just inventory or income. What they lost couldn't be measured in spreadsheets. It wasn't money, it was memory. And while they buried the past, someone else rewired the future. The dealership that outlasted war, but not Harley. In a small town outside Cleveland, Ohio, stood one of Harley-Davidson's oldest dealerships. Opened in 1952 by a Korean War veteran named Frank Dalton, it had remained in the same family for 70 years. Through every war, every market crash, and every evolution of motorcycle technology, Dalton's dealership stood tall. He had sold bikes to fathers, sons, and even grandsons. Locals called it the Cathedral. Not because it looked like a church, but because it felt like one. There were no marble floors or velvet ropes, just oil-stained concrete, the scent of gasoline, and the echo of shared stories. But in 2022, everything changed. Under Larry Hund's new luxury retail strategy, dealerships were required to meet expensive remodeling standards that had nothing to do with service or safety. These mandates demanded massive interior upgrades, polished floors, boutique merchandise displays, and a sleek, minimalist aesthetic that felt more like a tech showroom than a biker haven. When Dalton received the new requirements, he did the math and realized something heartbreaking. He couldn't afford to stay. There were no bailouts, no grace periods, no loyalty rewards for 70 years of service, just a cold letter and a choice. Spend 6 figures on renovations that betrayed everything his dealership stood for, or walk away. He closed the doors that fall. The day the news broke, local riders held a farewell ride. Hundreds came, some cried. Frank, now in his late 80s, told a local reporter, "I don't recognize the company I spent my life supporting." This wasn't just one closure, it was a funeral for a way of life. A generational bridge was torched. Riders no longer had a place to gather, to swap stories, to feel known. When that dealership died, part of Harley died with it. And while that funeral was happening, another Harley executive was preparing to bury something else entirely: combustion itself. The man who hated engines. When Ryan Morsy became Harley-Davidson's chief electric officer in 2020, many assumed it was a minor shift, another attempt to appear innovative. But what most didn't realize was that Morsy wasn't just tasked with building Harley's electric future, he was given the power to redefine the company's identity, and he came in swinging. Morsy had previously worked at Tesla, where his focus was electric vehicle infrastructure and clean energy development. His credentials made sense to Wall Street and ESG investors, but in the motorcycle world, his appointment was baffling. Morsy didn't ride. He didn't care about the roar of a V-twin. What he believed in was quiet, sterile, soulless transportation. In his first year, he redirected hundreds of millions of dollars toward Harley's electric division, funneling funding into the Livewire while deprioritizing the core models that had made Harley famous. And then came the moment that made the entire community gasp. During a 2022 product launch event, Morsy stood on stage and declared that traditional combustion motorcycles were holding back the industry. He spoke those words to a room full of Harley dealers and legacy riders, men and women who bled gasoline and chrome. The silence was deafening. Morsy wasn't just pushing new tech, he was openly dismissing the foundation on which Harley stood. Internal combustion engines weren't flaws to be corrected, they were sacred. They were the heartbeat of the Harley experience. The thunder, the smell, the vibration. These weren't marketing quirks. They were rituals. And Morsy didn't just ignore them. He wanted them gone. He didn't make a product mistake. He made a philosophical one, and yet somehow it gets worse. The corporate assassin. She didn't arrive with a wrench or a throttle in her hand. She arrived with a PowerPoint and a plan. Corin wasn't a rider. She wasn't a dealer. She wasn't even someone who pretended to love the open road. She was something far more dangerous, an ideologue with authority. Her official title may have read as something harmless, something in the realm of culture transformation or organizational evolution. But inside Harley-Davidson, she was known by another name, the corporate assassin. She didn't build anything. She dismantled it methodically and without apology. Corin came from the world of progressive consulting and corporate activism. Her resume was filled with glowing endorsements from tech companies, HR overhauls, and social impact frameworks. Her LinkedIn profile described her as a change agent and culture warrior. To Harley's board, that sounded visionary. To anyone who actually understood Harley's culture, it sounded like the end. Within weeks, sweeping DEI mandates were implemented across every department. On paper, it was framed as inclusion, but in practice, it felt more like an internal purge. Departments were restructured not around expertise or tenure, but around ideology. Longtime employees found themselves sitting in mandatory bias awareness sessions led by consultants who had never touched a motorcycle. And the message was clear: adapt or get out. What Corin considered progress, others saw as erasure. Symbols of Harley's rebellious past were quietly removed from internal communications. The lingo, the jokes, the stories, the things that gave the workplace a unique heartbeat, were replaced with sanitized corporate vocabulary. Team leaders were asked to rewrite job descriptions using inclusive language. Employee reviews were tied to cultural alignment. In other words, if you didn't adopt the new ideology, you weren't just unwelcome, you were expendable. And the purge wasn't limited to Harley's headquarters. Across the country, dealerships began reporting confrontations with Corin's compliance team. Family-run operations were told to update their environment, adopt new training programs, and eliminate non-inclusive signage. When some resisted, citing tradition or local values, they were simply dropped. No negotiations, no appeals, just silence. Corin didn't change Harley. She reprogrammed it. She rewrote the company's DNA and replaced a living culture with a sterile blueprint. And if you resisted, you didn't belong. But her most dangerous decision wasn't internal. It was aimed directly at Harley's loyal riders, and what she did next would provoke open contempt. To understand just how far Harley had drifted under Corin's rule, you only needed to look at its marketing. Gone were the gritty, sun-drenched images of riders carving through mountain roads. In their place, studio-lit influencers posing next to motorcycles they had never ridden, selling a version of Harley that didn't and couldn't exist. When the community pushed back, Corin didn't retreat. She doubled down. A campaign featuring a self-described urban freedom coach drew immediate mockery online. The rider wore pastel shoes shoes, oversized sunglasses, and carried a woven handbag across the tank. Social media exploded with ridicule. Riders posted side-by-side photos of themselves and the ad, captioning them with, "This ain't it." But Corrin's team responded by calling the backlash reactionary and resistant to progress. The phrase that ignited the most fury came from an internal memo leaked by a regional dealership manager. In it, Corrin described Harley's legacy customers as suffering from nostalgia bias. According to her, the problem wasn't the company, it was the customer's unhealthy attachment to the past. Decades of brand loyalty, personal sacrifice, and mechanical passion were rebranded as psychological weakness. Dealers who spoke out were swiftly reprimanded. Some were removed from corporate directories, others had inventory allocations quietly cut. The message was loud and clear. Question the narrative and you're out. Loyalty wasn't earned anymore. It was measured by ideological compliance. One Midwest dealer said it best. They wanted us to sell something we didn't believe in to people who didn't exist. Corrin had built a loyalty test, but it wasn't based on decades of riding or dedication to the brand. It was based on whether you would smile while watching everything burn. Then she did the unthinkable. She reached into Harley's heritage and ripped it apart. The heritage execution. Harley-Davidson didn't become a legend by chasing trends. It became a legend by honoring its lineage. Every model that survived for decades did so because it meant something, not just mechanically, but emotionally. That's what made Corrin's next move so devastating. She greenlit the cancellation of two of Harley's most beloved heritage models. These weren't aging, low-selling bikes, they were anchors. Machines that connected past to present, the kind of motorcycles that fathers passed down to sons, the kind of bikes that sparked stories, memories, and respect. And they were killed off, not because they weren't profitable, but because they didn't align with the new brand vision. In their place came what Corrin called gender-inclusive city cruisers. The name alone sparked confusion. The design sparked something worse. These bikes looked like Harley in shape, but that's where the resemblance ended. They were light, muted, and ergonomically neutral. They were built to satisfy checklists, not to inspire obsession. Corrin defended the move in a staff town hall streamed internally. "We are building a future where everyone can see themselves in our brand," she said, but for the riders watching, that future felt like a funeral. One employee, on the call for over 20 years, turned off his camera and left halfway through. "I felt like I was watching them bury something sacred," he later told a friend. For those who grew up in Harley families, the heartbreak was real. One rider from Pennsylvania had saved for over a year to buy the same model his father rode back in the 70s. When he went to the dealership, it was gone. "We don't carry that one anymore," the sales rep told him, "but we have this new urban cruiser. It's inclusive." The rider shook his head. "Inclusive of what?" he asked. "Because it sure isn't me." They looked like motorcycles. They felt like microwaves. But even that wasn't the final blow. There was still one thing left to break, and once it shattered, Harley could never recover. Still here? That means you care about what's real. Subscribe now, because we're not done exposing what happened behind closed doors. A crown without a kingdom. Every brand survives on trust. But Harley didn't just have trust, it had reverence. For over 120 years, it had been more than a motorcycle company. It was a symbol, a ritual, a tribe. And by the time Corrin and her cohort were finished, that sacred bond had been broken. Across the country, something shifted. Veterans removed Harley patches from their jackets. Clubs stopped organizing rides. Fathers told their sons to look elsewhere. Riders no longer spoke about Harleys with pride, they spoke with bitterness. What had once been a legacy had become a warning. In one heartbreaking moment, a rider from Sturgis, who had owned 9 different Harleys across 4 decades, posted a video online. In it, he removed the Harley-Davidson emblem from his garage wall and replaced it with an Indian motorcycle flag. His caption read, "The company left me. I didn't leave it." The cultural collapse wasn't loud. It was quiet, personal, and irreversible. It showed up in silence where there used to be exhaust, in canceled meetups, in empty dealership lots. In the uncomfortable pause when someone asked, "So you still ride a Harley?" the models changed. The sound disappeared. And now the soul's been stripped clean, but none of it was an accident. If you're ready to find out who really pulled the plug on Harley's future, watch the next video. And if this one struck a chord, like, comment, and subscribe. Real riders still deserve the truth.